talking about Israel and its relationship with South Asia. And yes, you guessed it right, there are absolutely no diplomatic ties when it comes to the country that it's only obvious that I'm going to lead up to, and that is Pakistan and Israel. Now, Islamabad has refused to recognize the Jewish state, but reports suggest that Pakistan and Israel have had secret contact with each other and have used their foreign embassies to cut deals, mediate and exchange information for decades. More in this report by WION's Pakistan Bureau Chief, Taha Siddiqui.
Two nations that don't speak, two countries born for the same reason. In the late 40s, Pakistan and Israel were both conceived on religious grounds, and to date, they remain committed to that ideology. Israel tried to build relations with Pakistan, but the Muslim majority country has refused to recognize Israel right from its inception. Islamabad's participation in the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War waged by Arabs upon Israel pushed the two countries farther apart. But in the 80s came the first change. There was collaboration between the two for the very first time in their history. And that was because of Pakistan's alliance with the United States during the Cold War era. Israel supplied weapons to the Pakistan army. These were forwarded to Afghan rebels who were fighting the Soviet invasion. Reports suggest that Israel has continued to supply military technology to Pakistan since then, but as diplomatic ties do not exist between the two countries, the routes are not the shortest and such deals are kept secret. But many Pakistani and Israeli leaders have expressed the desire to normalize ties between the two. Notably, Pakistan's former military dictator General Pervez Musharraf, who ruled Pakistan from 1999 to 2007. Given that New Delhi is now strengthening its own ties with the Middle Eastern Jewish power, many analysts feel that Islamabad may be pushed to review its hesitation over Israel too.
Although the government of Israel and Pakistan do not have any official relations, there have been a number of contacts between the two states. But given the fact that Pakistani leadership faces strong opposition from religious lobbies that the state itself strengthened, normalization of ties between the two countries may take a long time. This is Taha Siddiqui with cameraman Rao Bilal reporting for WION from Islamabad.
Joining me on the broadcast right now in the studio with me is WION Senior Foreign Editor Padma Rao. Also with us on Skype is my colleague Daniele Pagani. They're both going to give us a perspective on how exactly India figures in these, let's say, secret relations that Israel enjoys with Pakistan. Padma, are these very deep or intensive relationships that exist between India and Pakistan? We'll talk about Bangladesh later, between Israel and Pakistan. And where does India figure in it?
Do you want the good news first or the bad news?
Your choice.
Let me go to the history of Israel-Pak hostility, which has actually prevailed. During Israel's War of Independence, there were reports that Pakistan tried to divert 250,000 Czech rifles from Czechoslovakia to Palestinian Arabs. Also that Pakistan acquired 3 planes in Italy for the Egyptians. Then there was an involvement again in Israel's Six-Day War in '67 and in the Yom Kippur War. Pakistani pilots flew Jordanian and Syrian planes. After the Yom Kippur War, PLO signed an agreement with with Pakistan to train its military officers.
All right.
And in '82, during the Lebanon War, there were Pakistani volunteers who fought alongside the Palestinians against Israel, and about 50 of them were taken prisoner. And in more recent times, you've heard of Daniel Pearl, the journalist, the French writer Bernard Daniel Levy has said, although there's no evidence, that he was that the ISI helped or rather supported those groups that assassinated or killed him. Because he was considered a Mossad agent, though he was an American national. But he was Jewish. And the final point, which is interesting for people, young people today, is that Israel is said to have actually planned to destroy Pakistan's nuclear installment in Kahuta. And this is in the mid-80s sometime, when it actually sought help from India to launch the attack from Jamnagar in Gujarat. But that was refused because India has always followed, and wisely so actually, a policy of not allowing foreign militaries to be based in India. So those are the, that's the history. We'll come to the friendly relationship later, perhaps after you've had a word with Daniele.
Yes, but before I go to him, Padma, I also wanted to ask you, so, you know, we've been talking so much about Prime Minister Modi meeting President Trump and how perhaps Pakistan might have been watching everything that's happened in Washington DC very closely. But obviously this meeting between Benjamin Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi will also be watched with a very keen eye from Islamabad.
Yes, certainly, because I mean, not only is the strategic relationship going, but of course there is, you know, fear that India is the world's largest buyer of defense equipment, and Israel is one of our largest suppliers, and that relationship is bound to grow. Now, the interesting thing, Aisha, is that Pakistan has also supplied weapons to, Israel to Pakistan in the past when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. It's also, you know, maintained a certain level of contact with Israel. So it remains to be seen what they are likely to do to make overtures to widen that relationship.
Right.
Because if that happens, then of course there are worries in India or among Indians that, you know, the talk that former ambassador to India, Mark Sofer, told one of our reporters that, you know, that they're very pleased, Israel is very pleased about the dehyphenation by India of Palestine and Israel. Now, it remains to be seen whether the Israelis will also dehyphenate in case they're required to sell weapons to Pakistan all over again. But
right.
Officially so.
Right. You took the question right out of my mouth. Let me go across to Daniele. All right, I'm being told Daniele is going to join us in just a bit. But in the meantime, Padma, we were talking, of course, about, you know, let's say it's almost like a tightrope walk, right, for all these countries, and specifically India and Israel. Now, there is that question of Pakistan's relationship with Saudi Arabia and then the animosity between Saudi Arabia and Israel. So how exactly does one, you know, for the uninitiated who are still trying to grapple with foreign policy, how does this place India in some sort of conundrum? You know, does this further alienate Pakistan, and is that really what India wants to do at this point?
Well, I think one of the major factors is the United States, because let's not forget that the United States has a strategic relationship to Pakistan, but it also has relatively close ties to Saudi Arabia. We just, you know, witnessed that trip by President Donald Trump to Saudi Arabia, where he signed a deal for $112 billion. And he's actively or passively perhaps encouraging some sort of a rallying together of Sunni Muslims against the Shias.
Right.
Then there is this new situation with Qatar, you know, and the Indian presence in the Gulf is well known. There's a, you know, widespread presence of Indian workers in the Gulf. In the meantime, Indian professionals as well. So certainly, you know, but the axis keeps shifting as and when the United States takes any action.
Right.
Because the United States is an ally of both Pakistan as well as Israel.
Right.
Both Saudi Arabia as well as Israel.
Right.
And there are some common enemies and some common friends. So it depends on which side of that axis India happens to find itself in over a given situation that will determine how things move.
Okay, so Daniele is, as I'm given to understand, back with us on the conversation. Daniele, good evening. We're entering familiar territory, as it were, for you. We're talking about Pakistan, we're talking about the United States, and it seems like, as Padma is pointing out, the US is the lowest common denominator, if you will, in you know, these shifting axes between India, between you know, its relationship with Israel. Put in perspective for us where exactly Pakistan, its relationship with Saudi Arabia and India's overtures towards Israel figure when we're looking at the larger global scenario.
Well, it's pretty much a complicated issue. We'll try to break it down as simple as possible. So Saudi Arabia and Pakistan do share very close ties, both when it comes to intelligence and when it comes to military, and also when it comes, obviously, to religious ties. So where does Israel stand in all this? Israel, too, has a good and old and stable relation with Pakistan, especially when it comes to the military. And also, Saudi Arabia, surprisingly, and this is something which we need to take into account, and it's not easy to understand why it happened. Surprisingly, Saudi Arabia and Israel are getting closer and closer, and this is happening in the last years, but it is openly happening since the Qatar crisis initiated. If you remember, Aisha, just right after the Gulf Cooperation countries, spearheaded by Saudi Arabia and Egypt, declared and started fighting against Qatar and cornering Qatar, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu immediately said that he was happy to see that the Gulf cooperation countries finally understood that Israel was not the enemy, but Qatar was the enemy. So in this, Pakistan precisely falls in line with the strategy of Israel. And so this is what is happening right now.
Okay, on a related note, and we're talking about neighborhoods, Daniele, of course we have to look at Israel. It is of course surrounded by hostile neighbors. There's no diplomatic relations with many countries except Egypt. What kind of relationship exists right now between Israel and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon?
It's a complicated relation, I would say, especially the one with Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon and Israel have never shared a friendly relationship. They fought wars. And very recently, the chief of Hezbollah, which is the armed party, which is basically controlling Lebanon, even if not openly controlling Lebanon since at least 3 decades, said that they are ready to fight eventually against Israel in case of open hostilities. Also, Israel is directly, militarily intervening in Syria. They are bombing within Syria, but who they are bombing? They are bombing convoys of weapons and positions who are actually held by militants belonging to Hezbollah. Why so? Because Hezbollah is an armed Shia party which is supporting the Shia president Bashar al-Assad and has sent men and weapons in Syria. And this is not acceptable from Israel. Therefore, Israel is intervening in Syria against them.
Okay, so dizzying relationships, Padma, you know, who's connecting with whom and who's holding whose hand. But when we're talking about neighborhoods, we started off by talking about Pakistan. Let's turn our attention to Bangladesh. What sort of relationship, if there is one, exists between Israel and Bangladesh? And again, is that something that needs to be taken note of when we're viewing it from here in New Delhi?
Well, it's like a, you know, it's like a secret marriage, if you like, because Bangladesh happens to have the world's largest export industry of garments, for instance. A lot of garment manufacturers around the world have their garments manufactured in Bangladesh. And I believe Israel has provided the highest export revenues to Bangladesh in recent years. I mean, and that's grown in leaps and bounds over the years. But as far as formal diplomatic relations are concerned, there are none, just like Pakistan. So there is a dichotomy there, and that is, you know, if there can be a worrying factor for India, I don't see, I mean, from the bonhomie that we've seen on the screens today, I don't think that this relationship is going to take that kind of turn. But if there is a worrying factor, then the worrying factor would be if these nations that feel threatened by India, and I don't mean Bangladesh, but certainly Pakistan, feel that they want to recalibrate their relationship with Israel. What happens then? Is Israel then going to stand steadfast and loyal to its so-called friend India, with whom it, you know, it's celebrating 25 years of friendship, or is it just going to be business as usual and say, hey, we sell weapons to the, you know, entire world? Now, just quickly to come back to what Daniele said about the region, the immediate borders of Israel. Now, the thing is, I traveled there during the '82 Lebanon war, and I also I was in fact directly on the border, and I remember even then when there were conflicts, they were restricted mostly to the borders of Israel. Now, look at this, Aisha. There are wars raging all over the Middle East, but the borders to Israel have been the most peaceful for the last 30 years. Now, that cannot be a coincidence. You know, there's obviously some kind of mutual deterrence, or at least one-sided deterrence in place. You know, many of these countries don't have diplomatic relations. Egypt and Jordanian have a relationship with Israel, but Syria certainly does not. Lebanon does not, as Daniel pointed out. It's a complicated relationship. And at the same time, there's also a low level of trade actually being, you know, carried out on those borders. There are, you know, small border villages that fall somewhat like along our line of control in undefined border areas. Those people have been living together for years. So there is a certain amount of trade, you know, small scale stuff like fruit and, I don't know, farm produce and things like that. And those have been allowed to carry on. So it's not, you know, that is something that should be taken note of, that Israel's borders have been the safest in the world. Ironically, and all of them supposedly are hostile neighbors.
Daniele, what do you put that down to? I mean, does business trump all? I can't believe I'm using the word trump, but is that really that's helped keep Israel's borders safe, even though we keep hearing of hostilities with all these neighbors?
More than business, I would say that common enemies are shaping the policies of Israel within the West Asian scenario. For instance, Padma spoke about Egypt. Well, we perhaps thought that Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia were meant to be enemies forever, but this is changing quite a bit. Why so? They have several common enemies. One of their common enemies is Hamas in Palestine. The second common enemy is Qatar. The third common enemy is Iran. And the fourth common enemy, which perhaps is not very known by the international community, is the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the longest and largest Islamist political group which is active throughout the entire North Africa and the entire Arab countries in West Asia. They were behind the Arab Springs and they are behind Hamas. They have been supporting Hamas. They also were behind the previous Egyptian president Morsi. And after the crackdown in 2013, when Morsi was militarily attacked and then President al-Sisi came, Egypt declared war against the Muslim Brotherhood. The Saudis fear the Muslim Brotherhood because the Muslim Brotherhood is the largest so-called democratic party which is actually capable of overthrowing regimes and has been able to overthrow regimes. So more than business, I would say all these common enemies, Iran, Qatar, Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood, are uniting themselves and reshaping some of the alliances that Israel had. Israel is a very pragmatic country. It doesn't let anything off the table. Whenever something serves its national and regional interest, Israel has always been open to any sort of alliance and discussion.
So multiple alliances, a lot of intrigue as well. It's a veritable house of cards or Game of Thrones, if you will. I'm going to leave it at that. Daniele Pagani and Padma Rao, thanks both for being here on the broadcast with us.